So it's such a great pleasure to be here to introduce Joe Ferrie to all of you. Joe has been our fearless leader for almost 3 years. He might be able to tell you the exact number of days left that he has in being department chair. It's not been an easy time with the pandemic, the reckoning of diversity and inclusion issues within the economics profession. So I'm really happy to be talking with Joe today about his research and that he's been able to do some research in this last time period. So let me tell you a little bit about Joe the scholar. So he's an economic historian working on issues that are super important for us today. So let me just give you a couple of highlights of some of his work. He has looked at intergenerational mobility in Great Britain as well as the United States. He has looked at the long-term effects of cash transfers. This is something that I'm particularly interested in. As a development economist, I've also studied this question, but I can sort of only look at short-term or medium-term outcomes. And so it's really great to have work by Joe and other economic historians who can sort of help us think through what are going to be the long-term effects. And then another topic which has actually impacted my choice of housing in my family is his work on the long-term effects of lead in our drinking water, and has shown how in adulthood, there's long-term consequences in terms of income for kids that are exposed to lead in their drinking water. The way he goes about his craft is like data sleuthing. He finds all these different data sets and magically links them with individuals over time to give us sort of remarkable data sets. I too have a love for collecting data, but my people are alive, so I can just ask them things. And so it's a unique challenge that economic historians face and that I greatly appreciate. So before I hand it over to Joe, let me just remind those of you who are with us here to silence your cell phones. Joe is happy to take questions throughout his talk, but if you do have a question, please try to awkwardly pause while we pass you the mic so that people on Zoom can hear your questions as well. So please join me in welcoming Joe.
Thanks. 6 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days is how much longer I have as chair. This is, in fact, a demonstration of the fact that you can get stuff done when you're chair, but you really need a bunch of dedicated and ambitious co-authors, all of whom have way more time to work on this than you do. The co-author on this is Talitha Darrington, who's a senior scholar at the American Institutes for Research. They are the curators of the project talent data that you'll see me talk about in a few minutes. But there's a larger project of which this is part that has, among other co-authors, Claudia Golden and Claudia Olivetti. And over the next couple of years, you'll see some more of those results. I'll allude to where that research is going at the very end. This is one of the few projects that I've worked on as an economic historian where the people who, where the people that are the subject of the research are actually, in some cases, still alive. Because these are people who will have gone to school. Okay. This. Oh, I see. Wow. Okay. This is called hitting your mark, and I'm not that good at it. These people will have been born in the late 1930s and gone to school, in some cases, during the Second World War. And many of them are still alive today. And we'll see that we have actual data on them extending all the way up into their later lives when they show up in Medicare. So this is truly a life course analysis following people from their very early life to the very end of their lives. There's a couple of other pieces of this that you'll be curious about that you'll see more of in just a second. Let me just say that the basic idea here is a simple one. Try this. It's really a very simple idea. It's linking people from their exposure to preschool early in life to a variety of outcomes that occur in the years thereafter, focusing today on outcomes that they are observed to have in high school and at 5 and 11 years after high school graduation. We have all this other stuff that I'll talk about later on as well. Why bother? Well, as I'm sure anyone who's ever seen any research at IPR knows, there's an active interest in the importance of early life education on a variety of later life outcomes, not just preparation for later grades in school, but for what happens over the entire life course. Does it give you better labor market outcomes? Does it promote higher levels of educational attainment 15, 20 years down the road after your preschool experience has taken place? The challenge with a lot of the research that's been used to identify those kinds of effects is that it tends to be pretty small scale. We haven't had a lot of big experiments that allow us to do this kind of long-term follow-up. So the Perry Preschool program, the Absattikarian program, in fact, all of the work that Heckman has focused on involve no more than a total of 250 treated individuals. The samples themselves are somewhat larger because you got a control group in each one of them, but running these kinds of experiments and doing long-range follow-up over the course of 30 or 40 or 60 years is tremendously expensive and just not within the scope of anything that most places can actually fund. So the scale of these things is quite small. There are far fewer studies of universal programs. You may have seen just last week, there was more evidence that came out on the Boston preschool program. And there, the results seem to be that there wasn't much oomph that you got from the preschool experience. That's relying on the lottery driven nature of admission into the program when the slots are constrained. But very few have actually focused on this at a larger scale than that. Recent work by Martha Bailey has looked at Head Start and has actually shown substantial effects using the rollout of Head Start at different points in different counties and the ability to follow people from early life exposure to later life outcomes by looking at people's records in the census of population, and being able to see people as late as 2019 and 2020 in the American Community Survey. It's a question.
My question is whether the small scale of the evidence base is true for domestic studies or is true more generally. That is there better evidence from, say, Northern European studies or other international cohorts that have been followed over time?
There's a lot of evidence from Europe, especially from the Scandinavian countries, which are the usual suspects in any kind of research that involves tracing people across a long span of their lives. Challenge there is that until kind of recent waves of migration into Europe, into the EU, those populations have been quite homogeneous. And you don't get the opportunity to see where the benefits really derive in a population that's got a lot of diversity. Is it really benefiting people from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds? We're already starting out with a population where income inequality is already much lower than it is in the United States. You have much less scope for teasing out those kinds of subtle changes over time that the program may actually result in. So there is a lot of evidence for Europe, just not much for the more heterogeneous United States. So fewer studies of universal programs, a few that follow people into their senior years. The Perry and Absattikarian programs are just now getting to the point where they observe people in their late 50s. And these were studies that were done, initiated back in the 1960s and 70s. Finally, because those existing studies are small, it limits their generalizability. And it also really precludes a lot of important subgroup analysis of the sort that I just talked about a second ago, the ability to look at differential effects by the status of the individuals at the time they're treated. Nope. Okay, so the basic idea here is described in this timeline, following kids from early exposure to preschool during World War II, and I'll talk about why it happens during World War II, to high school, to early adulthood, and eventually to age 65 and Medicare. So US enters the war in 1941. The Lanham Act, which is passed in 1940, is rejiggered to allow the provision of preschool education to individuals in communities that are affected by the war effort. And whether a community was or wasn't affected by the war effort contained a lot of latitude. And that was something that made for a lot of flexibility and a lot of communities getting the benefits of the Lanham Act. By 42 and 43, conscription is extremely high. This is the peak of civilian conscription into the Army. And as a result, there are severe labor shortages across the country, not just in terms of producing things that were essential for the war effort, like munitions and trucks, but also simple consumer goods, food processing, clothing manufacture. A whole bunch of sectors were affected by these massive labor shortages. This program of preschools is a direct response to that. The idea is to encourage women with children to enter the labor force, to come in, drop off their kids, do an 8-hour shift, come back and pick up their kids. I'll talk more about the program in just a second. In 1960, the United States has something called Project Talent. You'll see this is right in the wake of Sputnik, and it's actually linked to Sputnik. The idea was to see whether the United States was doing a decent job of adequately allocating its talent across different kinds of uses in the economy, particularly in what we now know as the STEM fields. So Project Talent was basically a survey of 5% of the entire high school population in the academic year 1960. 5% of the entire student population, with detailed information from surveys of occupational interest, of personal interest, of family background, of teacher evaluations of behavior, and most importantly, its own battery of tests, IQ tests, standard math aptitude tests, reading aptitude tests, a whole bunch of subject area tests as well. All that information remains available. And this is a study that, to my mind, has actually been somewhat overlooked in the intervening years because there's been a lot more focus on things like the NLSY. But for the purpose of this study, this is ideal because these kids who are in high school in 1960 and are swept into Project Talent are exactly the kinds of kids, they're the right ages to have been subject to this World War II era preschool program. So we'll see exactly how that works. They're followed up at 5 and 11 years after graduation. They're also followed into Medicare, and I'll say a little bit about that later on. But that's the basic scheme for what we're going to be doing here. So here's the outline. What is this Lanham preschool experiment? It's actually pretty simple. Communities across the country were given funds by the federal government that were allocated under the National Defense Act of 1940, also known as the Lanham Act, hence the name Lanham Nursery Schools, or LNS, as I'll refer to them. And about 1,500 of these schools are established across the country in hundreds of towns and communities. I'll say a little bit more about exactly what they look like in just a second and show you literally what one of them looked like in just a second as well. The idea here is that fees were nominal, amounting to just a few bucks a week compared to the wages that a woman would make in manufacturing employment at this time. That was a very small amount of money to pay. Some actually operated 24 hours on a 3-shift system, and some of them are co-located with major manufacturing facilities. So you'd have a major plant right over here. At the gates to the plant, there would be a Lanham school where mom could drop off the kids and pick them up. They'd even cook your dinner and the mom could bring it home and feed it to the kids at home. It was a very elaborate system. Finally, they're in operation for a very short period of time, which is great from the perspective of an experimental design because you want a sharp start and a sharp finish. It's not so good for the kids who miss out on this. This thing is actively lobbied for by parents throughout the end of the war years, from the summer of 1945 right up through the beginning of 1946. And the government simply is unwilling to extend this past the emergency war effort for which it was originally sold. And this is why the United States doesn't have a universal preschool system even today. We had one, we shut it down for a variety of reasons that we can talk about later on. But it's a sharp start and a sharp finish. You can see over here the distribution of cities and towns that received Lanham schools. The red dots are counties where the grant to support schools went to the entire county rather than to an individual city or town. I'm not going to focus on those today. Instead, I'm going to focus on identified individual cities and towns. They're not going to be included in the analysis unless they are separately identified as having received Lanham funds. So for example, you'll see several counties in Florida received Lanham funds as a county, but of those, I'm only going to focus on the ones that also received separate Lanham funding for that city or town. There were no restrictions on the size of the places that could receive these funds. All you needed was some partner with which the federal government could work to set up the school, to acquire the resources, in most cases, it being just a classroom or two in an already existing grammar school, and that could help publicize it and make sure that people actually signed up for it. That's actually turning out to be something of a challenge for the program soon after it starts, because at this time, parents are not accustomed to sending their kids off to preschool. In most cases, if you had your kids being cared for under the age of 5 before they could enter school at age 6, they're being cared for by neighbors or by family members or by older children in the household. During the war years, however, when there's no male spouse around and mom tends to be absent if she's already in the workforce or wants to be, if there's an opportunity for her to go work, all sorts of stories start appearing in the media of latchkey kids and kids spending their entire day at the movie theater just because they've got nothing else to do, and that's where mom dumped them for the day. So that's part of the PR campaign that gets the Lanham program accepted by Congress and eventually by the parents themselves. But every state, except for New Mexico, gets Lanham funding. There are 2 exclusions that I'm going to make from the analysis today. California, which has a ton of Lanham schools, obviously because of the extent of wartime production on the West Coast, and New York City. Why? California's present day pre-K program is the direct descendant of the Lanham program. When I said it was shut down in the spring of 1946, that's true everywhere except California. California takes this thing and runs with it. And it's basically the blueprint and the direct parent of the current preschool program that we have in California. So there's no sharp end date for California. That requires an entirely separate analysis. So we're in the process of working on that separately. New York City is excluded because, for reasons that still are not clear to me, New York was never successfully able to make the case that it was substantially impacted by wartime labor shortages. And the people in New York City were not too happy about this. Congress was not very sympathetic toward New York City. They were more interested in seeing the money spread out across the country in the way that you see here. So New York City is excluded. New York City did have its own preschool program that was established at the same time, but it's done with city and state funds. That program needs to be evaluated separately as well. But otherwise, the entirety of the country is the subject of the experiment, and we'll see kids in Project Talent that are drawn from all of these places except California and New York City. Okay. This is one of the benefits of having a large number of photographers employed during the Great Depression by the federal government to give them income. This is a photograph that was taken by Gordon Parks, a famous photographer, of a Lanham preschool. These kids are sitting around the table and they're eating. This is important. This is important because when we're talking about the Lanham schools here, we're talking about a bundled treatment. It's not just stuff that they learned sitting around in a circle with a teacher or a teacher's aide, learning how to spell or learning how to memorize their numbers or learning how to simply interact in a socially productive way. They get meals, in some cases 3 meals a day. And these were considerably more generous and wholesome than what a lot of kids would probably have gotten at home at this time. They get health care. They were seen by a nurse on a routine basis, and anytime a kid showed any signs of any ill health, the nurse was brought in addition. So early identification of bad health conditions is another thing that comes out of this program. So that's part of the treatment. The other is that, obviously mom's not there. So part of the bundled treatment is being away from the mother. You could have children who are in Lanham preschool, even though their mother doesn't work. There's no requirement that the mother work, let alone work in one of these war production industries. But for the most part, these kids are coming in and they're separated from their home environment and their mother is working. So that's a whole bundle of different influences that you can imagine on the way that kid's development is shaped over the course of these 3 years, and the repercussions of that could extend well over the life course. So take away from this, bundling, and the fact that there's a bunch of different pieces to this treatment. Yeah.
Do we know if the kids in Lanham preschools were more likely to have their fathers away from home in the war effort than kids who are not in the preschools? So is father absence part of the bundle?
So you are raising the other important restriction on the analysis that I'll mention in a bit, which is that we don't know whether any of the kids that we are assuming were exposed to preschool actually attended a Lanham preschool. We're going to do an intent to treat analysis where exposure is the relevant metric. We can, for a small number of places, Schenectady, New York is one. There's a couple places in Ohio and California where we have actual daily rosters of the students who attended. And for those cases, we can actually link them back to their family, link the family back to World War II enlistment records, and see whether there's differential outcomes for the same treatment by whether the father was present or absent. We also have the ability to infer whether the mother was working, because we have a whole file of Social Security records, and we know what date people entered the Social Security system. And at that time, it was unconventional to get a Social Security number at birth, as we tend to do today. Instead, you got it when you had your first job in covered employment, which is employment outside the agriculture or domestic service sector. So if you can identify that date of Social Security issuance or application, that's the date that that mother entered the labor force, and we can assess whether for those particular kids, it's the effect of the mother or the father or neither that seems to matter. So that's another important part of the restriction here. Okay. Project Talent. This is the basis for our outcome measures, and it's a large number on the order of 500,000 or 600,000 kids who were swept into Project Talent in 1960. It's got a whole bunch of academic measures as well as personal interest measures and behavioral measures. It has stuff from a variety of measures of their behavior that are constructed in ways that allow you to tease out like the big five that psychologists are always concerned about, or any of the individual components of it, and observe whether these are outcomes that are somehow affected by preschool exposure. Then 5 years afterwards and 11 years afterwards, there's significant follow-up. We have these people with any record of college graduation or attendance at 5 years, and then a bunch of other outcomes at 11 years. Obviously, there's attrition between the original base sample and the subsequent follow-up, but AIR and Project Talent have done a great deal of work to try and construct weights to make the followed-up population as representative of the American population as was the base population in 1960. That's Project Talent. How are we going to link these people together? Well, we've got the Lanham Nursery schools operating between 1943 and 1946. We're going to look at birth cohorts in Project Talent from 1938 to 1943. 1938 senior in high school is going to be 22 years old in 1960, so perhaps not the brightest bulb in the box. But 1943 birth is going to be 17 and perhaps a little bit advanced to be a senior in high school. So these are the birth cohorts that we focus on. We then link them to the Project Talent data. How do we link them? We link them geographically. We take all of the towns and cities in the Project Talent data and georeference them, assigning GNIS codes to each one. We've already got GNIS codes, which are unique codes for cities, towns, and places from the geographic survey. I can't remember what the full name is. But we have that for each one of the places that we have listed as a Lanham school. And we simply link together the kids based on their 1960 location to their preschool possible exposure. Now, there's a challenge here, which is that we don't know for sure whether everybody in Project Talent was in the same place as they are in 1960 when they could have been exposed to preschool during the war. So we're forced to focus on a subset of the Project Talent population, which is those who in 1960 say that they're living in the same city or town where they were living when they were born. They were born into this place, they're still there in 1960. The extent of inter-county and intercity migration in the period between the Second World War and 1960 it's not trivial. So we'd like to know more about the people who migrated from their time of exposure to where they end up in 1960. But for today, we can't do that right now. We need to get more information on the place of birth of those people. All we know is the region for those people who migrated. We'll know more when we've linked them to Social Security records as well. Once we've done that, we've got base year results, 5-year follow-up, and 11-year follow-up. So what's the basic question? Is access to preschools, and I mean access to preschools in the sense that you were residing when you were born and spent your early life in a place that received a Lanham preschool, does that access predict base year outcomes, those that are observed in high school? And then educational attainment, employment, and income 5 years and 11 years post-high school. Also, are there any effects of the Lanham Nursery School exposure that are heterogeneous across groups? And we have a variety of metrics that we can use to assess the heterogeneity of the target population. So we can observe, for example, parental education. We know parental socioeconomic status, we know race. That we know a bunch of things about the parents that would allow us to partition the population into these different groups and see whether the effect varies across them. I won't show you very much of that today here, except to show you differential results by sex. Everything we're going to do is going to be segregated male versus female. But that's the basic scheme of things here. What are we going to do? Well, first, we're going to take the simplest approach, which is to partition the sample by grade and take advantage of the fact that 11th and 12th graders who were in Project Talent in 1960 and are residing in the same place where they grew up would have had full access to the Lanham Nursery School. What I mean by full access is that they would have been between the ages of 2 and 5 for the entirety of the calendar period between May 1943 and the beginning of March of 1946. So because their birth cohorts line up ideally with those that would have had full exposure, a full 33 months of treatment in Lanham, they're going to be the group in high schools that are going to have the most exposure. 10th graders would have had partial access. They could have been in the preschools for part of that time. 9th graders would generally have been too young to participate in the Lanham Nursery Schools unless they had been already left back a couple of times and should have actually been with the 10th graders. So that's the first thing we'll do, stratify by grade and look at a Lanham effect. Second thing we'll do is use a continuous measure of exposure, which is straightforward because we know the actual age for each one of these kids, and we know the school opening age for each one of the places in which these kids lived. That is, we know the maximum, the maximum age that you could remain out of school in these places and not run afoul of the local school truant authorities. That means for every kid in the data, with their birth date known in Project Talent, the school eligibility date being known, and the opening and closing dates for Lanham being known, we can calculate the exact number of months that each person in the data was likely to have been exposed to the Lanham Nursery School. So we'll use that as well. What we're going to use in both cases is essentially a simple difference in differences approach. We are going to compare the effect of having spent time in a Lanham preschool between kids in 9th grade in places that got it versus kids in 9th grade in places that did not have Lanham schools. That is, we're going to look at 9th graders in these two places. There shouldn't be much, if any, effect of Lanham in that comparison because the ninth graders are all too young to have been substantially exposed to the Lanham preschools. When you get to the 10th graders, you've instead got kids in Lanham places and kids in non-Lanham places, just in the 10th grade, where the 10th graders will have had some exposure. The 10th graders in the non-Lanham places won't. And you can look at the difference in the effect of Lanham versus not for those 10th graders. Do the same for the 12th graders. So it's basically looking at three groups, 11th and 12th, 10th and 9th. And within each of those groups, comparing outcomes for those in Lanham places versus not, and just looking at the outcome coefficient for Lanham. Yes. Yep.
In the non-Lanham schools or the non-Lanham participants, I mean, you could have differential exposure to parents in-house and out of house. So I'm just wondering if you are able to accommodate that. Does that make sense?
Yes. We will, once we have these people linked, we're going to link all of the Project Talent people to the mother's Social Security entry date and to the father's World War II enlistment date. And at that point, for both Lanham and non-Lanham, we'll know whether the kids' parents are present or absent and be able to add that as another difference between the two groups. Yep. Exactly. Yep.
Do you know what fraction of kids in the 11th and 12th graders actually attended Lanham in those localities where it was offered?
From the places where we've got actual records of Lanham attendance, it looks like the number of kids in the right age range who are actually attending is somewhere around 14%. So the take-up rate that you should use to extrapolate from an intent to treat to a treatment on the treated is kind of 14%. You may want to jack everything up by a factor of about 7, but that's something that you can think about separately. We do know something about participation rates at the state level, and we can get an even finer measure of participation to jack up the coefficients from that. Okay. So we'll use these two different strategies. And now I'm just going to show you a couple of simple pictures that are really the main part of the story here. The first one is looking at one particular outcome measure. I could do this for all the outcomes that we have. This is academic aptitude, and these are year and quarter of birth. And what we're concerned about for doing the diff and diff, as usual, is pre and post trends. And this is the closest I can get to being able to show something like that. There's a lot of noise in the pre-period. That is for kids who have had 100% exposure, the ones who were born in 1940, just past the first quarter. Before that, it's really hard to see what the differences are. But if you look instead at the other end, at the populations that had 0 potential exposure because they were born after the last year when they could have plausibly gotten into a Lanham preschool, there's very little difference between them. Instead, you can see differences here among the groups that are treated the 1942 quarter 1 through 43 quarter 1 birth cohorts. Smaller differences early on, which is puzzling, as we'll see, because this is the group that had more exposure. It's the group that had actually less time exposed that seems to have slightly better outcomes. What I want you to take away from this is not so much that difference as the fact that the difference lies in between these two gray lines, and to the right of the gray line, there doesn't seem to be much difference between Lanham treated kids and non-Lanham treated kids. Okay. Now, the first set of results. We're going to hypothesize that outcomes for the 9th grade shouldn't really differ a whole lot between the Lanham nursery school population and the non-Lanham. If we look at the effect of Lanham, a coefficient on just the simple dichotomous variable, were you in a Lanham place or not, and compare those coefficients across these grades, our anticipation is that the coefficients should be increasing in the grade at which you were observed in 1960, because that's increasing in the amount of potential exposure that you had to a Lanham preschool. Does that turn out to be the case? Well, Here's one example. These are results for men at base year and stratified by our 3 grade groups: orange, blue, and gray. And the pattern that we're looking for is if there is a Lanham effect, then the gray should be to the right, the blue should be somewhere in the middle, and the orange should be to the left. And I've shown you 95% confidence intervals so you can see whether you should have much faith in these as being actual statements of difference. So you can see that, for example, for IQ, it's clear that the 11th and 12th graders with the maximum exposure are better off than the 10th graders, but we can't say that the 10th graders are definitely better off than the 9th graders. Down here for the math composite, the results are more striking and much more consistent with baseline hypothesis here. We've got the 11th and 12th graders out to the right, significantly different from the 10th and 11th graders, and a small amount of overlap in the confidence intervals between the 10th graders and the 9th graders. Over here, I wouldn't put too much faith in this particular result, but it does show that the kids who were treated are smaller on average when they're measured in 1960. But again, not by a statistically significant difference. Verbal composite, we see much the same. Academic aptitude, the same as we were seeing up above for IQ. So overall, I take this as somewhat suggestive that there's a big difference between the maximally exposed and the partially and no exposed groups. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. These are all standardized. So these are all on a mean of 100, except for the height. I think the height is in actual. It's in some units, but it doesn't go from 0 to 100. It's something else. But that's why I think we can look at this with some confidence as saying that you can look across the different domains here and be able to say something meaningful. That's men. This is women. Exact same outcome metrics, exact same methodological procedure, and substantially different results. You don't, for example, see the effect on IQ that you saw for males. You don't see it for academic aptitude. In fact, the only place where the 12th graders seem to stand out is the composite mathematics aptitude score. And there, you can see that the numbers line up in the way anticipated. 12th grade and 11th grade are in fact statistically different from the 9th graders, and the 10th graders are somewhere in between. So a preliminary conclusion that I would draw from this is that there is some suggestive evidence that for males, there is a Lanham preschool effect, but for women, not so much, except possibly for the composite score in math. Yeah. Christine.
This is really interesting. I had a question about the men. Is there any way you can evaluate if there's differential survival? If that's the story with height, that these nurse visits caught some early, and so there's differential survival and.
Yes. So what we can do when we get them into the Social Security records is we can see, conditional on having survived to age 65, how likely is it that you continue to survive X number of years? The problem is we don't have good vital statistics for anybody below the age of 65 born in this period. So all you can do is look at 65 and over. For California, which has really good birth and death data going back well into the 1960s, we can see exactly what those differences might be by Lanham versus non-Lanham exposure. And that's the one place where we may be able to do it at some significant scale. Yes, it's obviously an interesting question and an interesting part of the bundle of that treatment that they're receiving that we want to be able to say more about. We'd also want to be able to say more about their general health because they're getting better meals than the kids are who are in places that didn't get Lanham preschools during a critical period for physical and intellectual development, right in that age between 2 and 5, and they're getting much better food. And we just don't have the ability right now to see whether that really matters. That might be part of what matters when you see these better test scores later on. We just don't know because we can't tease out that separate effect. Okay. These are the personality measures, the different kinds of measures of individual personality. Left is bad, I think, for all of these, except for impulsivity. I think we may have rescaled impulsivity, so left is bad too. But either way, you can see that it's not a clear-cut case by any means that Lanham kids have better social outcomes, at least by this set of metrics. It certainly looks like there are some cases in which the Lanham kids are doing not so good. So for example, in terms of vigor, I don't know how vigor is even measured, but vigor is significantly worse for the kids who are in Lanham at any degree of exposure versus those who are not. So this should also give us some pause when thinking about what the effects are of preschool. It might not be unambiguously positive. And even today, in some preschool evaluations, there's evidence that kids' behavior can deteriorate in ways that run the opposite direction from their academic achievement. And that's something we should be able to say more about once we get more information on the different kinds of exposure that these kids are getting. Is it just because mom's not around? Is it because dad's not around? Or is it because of presence in the preschool itself? But either way, this is a note of caution that you should take away, that it's not all a bed of roses for the Lanham participants. This is for men. For women, the results are actually even worse. That is, there are more cases where the 12th and 11th graders, the maximum exposure, are to the left of the 10th graders partially exposed and the 9th graders virtually unexposed. Lower levels of leadership, lower levels of maturity, lower levels of sociability, and calmness. All those things can be seen to suffer from presence in a Lanham school. Remembering that it's not just the presence in the school that matters, it's this whole bundle of other circumstances that are attendant upon being present in a Lanham preschool. This is 5 years out. This is when each of these high school classes was 5 years past high school graduation. So this is calculated for 1971 through 1974. And all we've done here is adjust for inflation. What you can see here is that there doesn't seem to be, for either group, a substantial difference in having attended any college. Nothing that's obvious in terms of college graduation for men. For women, again, nothing in the way of a substantial difference in any college. And graduated college, the dots line up in the right pattern, but there's nothing statistically significant there. So at 5 years post-graduation, it doesn't look like there's much that has persisted. What about later than that? What about when we get to 11 years post-graduation? These are outcomes for men at 11 years post-graduation. Income seems to have a big effect. This is the first time we can measure income. We don't have income measured for the 5-year follow-up. The first time we get it is at 11 years. This is a measure that we'll be able to follow up with an enormous sample in the work I'm doing with Claudia Golden and Claudia Olivetti, where we're linking people from Lanham exposure into the American Community Survey and the census of population from 2000 to 2018, and the current population surveys from 1973 down through 2018. There we'll have a complete picture of adult incomes. This is young adult incomes. This is people who are not yet even getting to the age of 30. And you can see that there's a substantial difference in the incomes where the pattern aligns with what our expectations are if the Lanham school is doing something positive. For the women, for the occupational blue collar, no substantial difference. College graduation and any college, still no difference. And nothing else in terms of job satisfaction or unemployment. But the income number is definitely there. I don't, off the top of my head, have the ability to tell you what percentage of annual income is represented by the difference between the 11th and 12th grade coefficient and the 9th grade coefficient. But ask me again later today and I can probably tell you. For women, oops. Oh, I think I must have forgotten to put the slide in for women. The slide for women, oh, there we go. This is 11th year outcomes, 11 years post-baseline for women. And it looks like some income difference for any exposure to Lanham. But the other measures, apart from job satisfaction, don't seem to show much of a positive effect. So here too, it looks like there's something that can be seen 11 years post-graduation from high school. It's not as though there was an income effect at 5 years that we didn't see. Income wasn't asked at 5 years. It would have been ideal if it were. This is the first time income gets asked post-graduation. So it's here for women, it's here for men, and also the job satisfaction seems to be greater among women who attended Lanham Preschool. I don't have a mechanism to describe why that latter effect might be there. It's something we're in the process of thinking a whole lot more about. We'll know a lot more about the kind of work that people are doing, the specific kinds of jobs that they become engaged in after Lanham exposure versus not, when we do the work with the Social Security data, CPS, Census, and ACS. That's kind of on the menu for the larger project. I promised some results with a continuous measure of exposure to the Lanham Preschool. Here, the continuous measure is the number of months that you were between the ages of 2 and 5 years during the calendar period, March 1943 through the beginning of, May 1943 through the 1st of March in 1946. So kids who are born in exactly the same year will have the same amount of exposure. And kids of different ages will have different amounts of potential exposure, although there'll be some large group of people that have both the maximum and the potential minimum. So here we're just looking at a narrow set of outcomes, just the academic aptitude at baseline in 1960, and the income measured in 1971 through 74 in 1974 dollars. And this is from a regression that includes 3 things. One is a dummy for whether you grew up in a Lanham place. The second is the actual number of months that you were between the ages of 2 and 5 in that calendar period. And we can define that for kids who were not in Lanham places. It's telling us what, if anything, was the effect of growing up an additional month in that particular period of calendar time. Then there's an interaction between being in a Lanham place and your continuous measure of exposure. And this is what we're calling the preschool effect, because it's comparing the effect of an additional month of calendar time exposure between the ages of 2 and 5, Lanham places versus non-Lanham places. If there are things that are particular to having been going through this important developmental phase in your life during this period between the spring of 1943 and the winter of 1946, they should be common across the 2 kinds of places: general forces in the economy, shortages, the kinds of things that you may think would have an effect on kids' subsequent development. We're comparing that effect, Lanham school places versus non-Lanham school places, and taking the interaction effect as being the effect of preschool exposure. So it's different differences of the most simple sort. What do you see when you look at that? In terms of the preschool effect, the coefficient on the interaction between Lanham and the continuous measure of exposure, there is an effect for academic achievement. And how to scale that is the maximum exposure you could get is 33 months. So someone in a Lanham place who got 33 months of exposure had 33 times 0.03 extra points on their academic aptitude score compared to kids who had the same number of calendar months in that time but were not in Lanham places. It may not be a very impressive number given that this is scaled between 0 and 100. The IQ and academic aptitude are scaled that way, but it's nonetheless possible to discern this. The other thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the magnitudes of these coefficients is that this is intent to treat. We don't know for sure that these kids actually attended. We just know that they're in a place where they could have attended. Only 14% of those kids probably did. So if you want to multiply that coefficient times 7 and then times 33, you're getting closer to something that you'd want to stand up and pay attention to. As for preschool, we see it for men and we see it for women. What we don't see is any effect on income that we were seeing earlier, comparing especially the 11th and 12th graders, men and women, versus any of the less exposed groups. You do it in a continuous measure here, you don't see the same kind of effect on income. Why might that be? It's possible that there are simply nonlinearities in the effect of exposure that we're not picking up with the continuous measure here. There are no higher order terms in exposure that have been added to the regression here. Instead, it's just a linear effect. If it matters later to have had more experience earlier in the period when Lanham schools are open, that's not going to show up here. It will, however, to some extent be captured by the breakdown that we have in the previous analysis where we've got it separated by grade, 10th and 11th, 11th and 12th, 10th and 9th grade. At that point, there is the possibility that those sorts of nonlinearities could be captured, but just not here the way we've done it. Let me offer you some conclusions and a couple of directions for future research. One thing to note that I think is particularly important when it comes to thinking about whether these are things that we should worry about when we talk about expanding preschools in the United States to a national scale. There's a great deal of heterogeneity between men and women among grades in both the benefits of growing up in a Lanham area and the added benefit of being in a Lanham nursery school. So those Lanham preschool effects are very different for men versus women. The effects tend to be greater for males than for women. This is not inconsistent with what some of the smaller randomized modern studies have found. The benefits tend to accrue more often to males than to females. Again, there are various hypotheses in the developmental literature as to why that might be the case, but it's something that we can also see here in the Lanham data. In terms of high school academic measures, there are a variety of Lanham nursery school attendance benefits, Lanham nursery school exposure. For men, there's added benefit for women in math for the fully exposed group, the 11th and 12th graders. And there are some examples of the dose response kind of gradient that you'd expect with grade heterogeneity, both in the dichotomous breakdown by grade analysis and also here in the analysis with the continuous measure, where you can see that the outcome does appear to be, at least for the academic aptitude, greater for those who have had a greater amount of exposure, consistent with a dose response. Keep in mind all the shortcomings of this. Everything that I've already alluded to is important to keep in mind as the things that may want to make you skeptical of these results. The fact that it focuses just on people who were still in the same place in 1960 as they were when they were born. It eliminates two major sources of population, New York City and California. It also doesn't tell us anything about actual Lanham preschool attendance. It just tells you whether you grew up in a place that got one of these. You can come up with a complicated story under which it's the place that matters and not the Lanham preschool. For example, suppose the places that got Lanham preschools were the ones that were most likely to have a group of organized, interested, and involved parents. The sort of audience for the receipt of this money that the federal government is actually looking for. In places with parents less organized and less apt to participate in their kids' learning, you may just never get a Lanham preschool. You may expect that simply by virtue of having been in one of these places, you may be better off. We do have some ability to compare Lanham places versus not and try and weight for various population level characteristics at the level of cities and towns. We have a whole set of entropy weights that we created for Lanham and non-Lanham places that allow us to generate population level statistics that mimic those in the general US population by imposing these weights. The problem there is that I still haven't gotten a good handle on how reliable I think those weights are. If you look at the distribution of places that got Lanham schools versus those that didn't, just in terms of something like log population, there's a very large area where the support does not overlap those two distributions. And that's really worrisome in trying to construct weights to try and equalize those populations. So I haven't yet come up with a satisfactory way of weighting them in a way that gets rid of some of those concerns. But that's exactly the sort of thing that you should be worried about in seeing me state these things as conclusions. We also, again, don't know what specific component of the Lanham treatment it is that matters for these people. Is it time in the classroom? Is it health? Is it food? Is it the fact that your parents were no longer present at home during the day, or in the case of your father, at home at all during the war? We have no ability right now to be able to say which of those mechanisms matter. In terms of the personality measures, it looks like there's no added benefit for either sex and some negative effects. 5 years post doesn't look to be a big story for either group. 11 years post, clear benefit for men in terms of income and perhaps some for women. Now let me say what's next. Project Talent has already linked the Project Talent participants, the 1960 high school students, into Medicare. So we can observe a variety of outcomes for them after they get to the age of 65. And again, this is conditional on them getting to age 65. We can observe their mortality, both in terms of the length of their lives and the specific cause from which they're reported to have died. But I think more importantly, we can also measure morbidity. We have a variety of conditions that we can observe in the data and whether individuals, once they got into Medicare, were reported to have had any of these conditions. Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and the whole gamut of things that affect people in later life, some of which have important early life correlates that may come through the channel of behavior, or it may come through something else. For example, smoking, drinking, eating. We'll know at the very least the extent to which Lanham school exposure is related to these things. I'm not sure yet that we can say something absolutely causal about them in the absence of knowing a well-defined channel. And then, in addition to the Medicare, we've got these LNS people, that is kids that we can identify as having been born in a specific location in this particular window and immediately before and after, linked to the 1940 census when they're still kids, to the 1973 and 79 through 20 CPS, to the SIP, the American Community Survey, from which we can get measures of adult income, educational attainment, and disability, and do so not for just a population like the 600,000 that we did it for here with the Project Talent data, but for millions of individuals without regard for whether they moved between their early life home and where they were observed later in life. Because here we're starting out with Social Security records that identify people's place of birth down to the level of the city or town and make it possible to then link those people to whether there was a Lanham school in those places. So hopefully about a year from now, I'll be able to report on some of those results as well. Thanks.